Hey there, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most famous stories ever, the birth of Jesus. You've shared some really interesting source material with us, excerpts from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, along with a sermon and blog post by Gregory Crawford. So we have the original account from the Bible, plus Crawford's interpretations, kind of like looking through two different lenses at the same event.
It's fascinating how Crawford goes beyond just retelling the story. He digs into those deeper layers of meaning, prompting us to think about the implications of this event, not just historically, but for our lives today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin, of course, with the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary, a young woman from Nazareth. Luke paints this vivid picture of the encounter where Gabriel tells Mary she's going to give birth to the Son of God. I don't know about you, but I think most people would have a complete meltdown right there.
It's hard to even fathom, isn't it? But Mary's response is incredible. She says, "I am the Lord's servant. Let it be with me just as you have said." It's not just acceptance. It's a statement of complete surrender and trust in God's plan.
Wow, such powerful words. And then we get this interesting contrast with Joseph's reaction in Matthew's Gospel. He finds out Mary's pregnant, and understandably his world is rocked. He's even considering a quiet divorce, which tells us he was a man of compassion, even in the midst of this confusing situation. But then an angel appears to him in a dream and reveals the divine nature of Mary's pregnancy.
And what's remarkable is that we don't hear a single word from Joseph in the biblical account. He simply acts in obedience to the angel's message.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what was going through his mind during all of this.
I know. It really highlights how there's not just one way to respond to God's call. We have Mary's vocal, almost poetic declaration, and then Joseph's quiet, resolute action, both powerful expressions of faith in their own way.
Exactly. And I think that's something Crawford would agree with. He often talks about how God meets us where we are and uses our unique personalities and gifts to accomplish his purposes.
All right, so we've got the miraculous conception. But then the story takes another turn with the journey to Bethlehem. Luke tells us about this Roman census that forces Joseph and Mary to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, which happened to be Joseph's ancestral home.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus unknowingly played a role in fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Talk about unintended consequences.
Right. It's like this massive historical event orchestrated by a powerful ruler ends up paving the way for the fulfillment of God's plan. Pretty mind-blowing. So they arrive in Bethlehem exhausted from their journey and find that there's no room at the inn, a line that has become synonymous with feeling overlooked or rejected.
And it sets the stage for the humble circumstances of Jesus' birth. Born in a stable, laid in a manger. Not exactly the grand entrance you might expect for the Son of God, right?
Definitely not the royal welcome. But there's such beauty in the simplicity of it all, and it makes the arrival of the first visitors even more striking. Luke tells us about these shepherds who were out in the fields watching their sheep at night.
And it's important to remember that shepherds weren't exactly high on the social ladder back then. They were considered rough, uneducated, the low class of society.
So why do you think God chose them to be the first to hear about Jesus' birth?
I think it speaks to the heart of God's character. He often chooses the overlooked, the marginalized, to reveal himself to. It's a reminder that God values humility and simplicity over status and power. It's also a beautiful picture of how the good news of Jesus' birth is for everyone, no matter their background or social standing.
I love that. And they don't just get a whisper of good news. They get a full-on angelic choir. Luke describes it as a multitude of the heavenly host praising God. I can only imagine the sheer awe and wonder the shepherds must have felt.
And the message from the angel is so clear and concise. They're told that a Savior has been born in Bethlehem and given a very specific sign. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The shepherds don't hesitate. They don't question. They immediately head to Bethlehem to find the baby. And this is something Crawford picks up on in his blog post. He talks about the importance of immediate obedience to God's call.
Yes. And he contrasts the shepherd's response with our tendency to procrastinate or make excuses when God asks us to do something. He challenges us to be more like the shepherds, to cultivate a spirit of readiness and willingness to follow God's leading.
Okay, so we've got Mary and Joseph, the humble birth in a stable, and these awestruck shepherds. But Matthew introduces us to another group of travelers drawn to the newborn king, the wise men from the east.
And their journey is a testament to the fact that Jesus' birth was not just a local event, it had cosmic significance, drawing people from far-off lands to seek out this newborn king.
And they're guided by a star, which adds this whole other layer of symbolism to the story.
Absolutely. The star has been interpreted in various ways, but it ultimately points to the idea that Jesus' birth was a sign from heaven, a beacon of hope for all humanity.
And these wise men come bearing gifts too, right?
Yeah.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What's the significance of those gifts?
Each gift carries symbolic meaning. Gold, of course, represents royalty and kingship, acknowledging Jesus as the true king. Frankincense was a fragrant resin used in worship, signifying Jesus' divine nature and his role as our high priest. And then there's myrrh.
Yeah, that one's always intrigued me. It seems a little out of place given the celebratory atmosphere.
It is interesting, isn't it? Myrrh was often used in burial rituals, but it was also a valuable substance used in perfumes and medicines, sometimes even given to newborn kings. So it's a bit of a paradox.
What do you make of that?
Well, some scholars see it as foreshadowing Jesus' dual role. He is both the king who will reign forever and the suffering servant who will ultimately give his life for humanity. The myrrh hints at both his glorious kingship and his sacrificial death.
That's a really insightful interpretation. It adds a whole new layer of depth to the gift. But their arrival also triggers a very different reaction from King Herod. When he hears about a newborn king, he's not exactly thrilled.
Right. And Matthew describes Herod as being troubled by this news. He sees Jesus as a potential threat to his power and authority. So we see this stark contrast between those who are drawn to Jesus and those who are threatened by him.
It highlights this clash between worldly power and the coming of God's kingdom. Herod represents the old order, the status quo, while Jesus represents something completely new and revolutionary. It's like the world is being turned upside down.
And that tension runs throughout history, doesn't it? The struggle between those who cling to power and those who embrace the message of hope and transformation that Jesus brings.
All right, so we've got the miraculous conception, the journey to Bethlehem, the humble birth, the shepherds, the wise men, and this underlying tension with King Herod. What's amazing is how Crawford, in his sermon, manages to pull all these threads together and distill them into three powerful lessons.
He does. And it's a testament to his ability to connect these ancient events to our lives today. He's not just giving us a history lesson, he's inviting us to engage with the deeper meaning of the Christmas story and see how it speaks to our own experiences.
Okay, let's dive into those lessons. What did Crawford want his listeners to take away from all of this?
His first point, and I think this is a good jumping off point for us, is that God delights in simple people who love him. He uses Mary and Joseph as prime examples. They were ordinary people who said yes to this extraordinary calling.
I find that incredibly encouraging. It means God can use any of us, no matter our background or social status, if we're open to his leading. I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking we need to be super spiritual or have all our ducks in a row before God can use us. But this story reminds us this is just not true.
Exactly. And Crawford goes on to ask his listeners directly, are we available?
Yeah.
Which I think is such a powerful question. It's a call to examine our own hearts and see if we're truly open to God's leading, even when it might seem inconvenient or disruptive to our plans.
It makes me think about how often we might miss out on God's best because we're too busy or too focused on our own agendas. It's like we need to create space in our lives for the unexpected, for those divine interruptions that can lead us in directions we never imagined.
Absolutely. And Crawford's second lesson ties into that beautifully. He says, big things often start small. He even uses the example of Apple starting in a garage, which is interesting because we tend to think of Apple as this tech giant, but its origins were incredibly humble.
Right. And I love how he brings it back to the birth of Jesus, born in a stable yet destined to change the course of history. It's a reminder that we shouldn't underestimate the power of seemingly small beginnings. Sometimes the most significant things start in the most unexpected and unassuming places.
It challenges us to look beyond outward appearances and recognize the potential for greatness in the ordinary in ourselves and in others. It's like those tiny mustard seeds that grow into massive trees.
And Crawford really hits home with that third lesson, the one about immediate obedience. He uses the shepherd's response to the angel as the model, highlighting how they didn't hesitate or make excuses, they just went.
It's a great illustration of what James calls pure religion, putting faith into action. But Crawford doesn't stop at praising the shepherds. He turns the spotlight on us and asks, what has God been telling us to do, but we have been stalling?
Oof, I felt that one. It's easy to get caught up in procrastination or find reasons to delay obeying God's promptings. But as Crawford points out, delayed obedience can easily become disobedience.
And I think he's also getting at the heart of what it means to truly trust God. When we hesitate or delay, it often stems from fear or doubt. We're not sure if God's plan is really the best for us, so we try to control the situation or come up with our own solutions. But immediate obedience is an act of surrender, a way of saying, God, I trust you, even if I don't fully understand.
That's such a good point. It's like we're saying yes to God's adventure, even if we can't see the entire map laid out before us. We're trusting that He knows the way and will guide us every step of the journey. But Crawford doesn't just focus on the potential pitfalls of disobedience, he also highlights the positive side. He says, because the shepherds obeyed right away, they received the blessing of their obedience right away.
Exactly. There's joy and fulfillment in following God's leading, even if it takes us out of our comfort zones. And, it's interesting to think about how the shepherds' immediate obedience also allowed them to witness something truly extraordinary.
Right. They got to be there in that stable, seeing the newborn king with their own eyes. That's a powerful reminder that obedience often leads to incredible blessings and experiences that we would never have encountered if we had stayed put.
And, thinking back to those wise men, we see another example of obedience, but on a much grander scale. Imagine the faith it took for them to leave their homes and families and journey for months guided only by a star to find a king they had never met. It's a testament to their deep desire to seek truth and worship the one true God, no matter the cost.
Their story is mind-blowing, and it makes me wonder, are we willing to be that persistent in our pursuit of God? Are we willing to step out in faith even when the path ahead seems uncertain?
It's a challenging question, isn't it? It requires us to examine our own motivations and priorities. Are we content with a superficial faith? Or are we willing to dig deeper to seek a more profound understanding of God and His purposes for our lives? In his sermon, Crawford talks about how God uses unlikely people to accomplish His greatest purposes. He points to Mary and Joseph, these ordinary individuals who were chosen to be the earthly parents of Jesus. He talks about the shepherds, those rough around the edges outsiders who were entrusted with the first proclamation of the good news.
And even those wise men, pagans from a distant land, were drawn by God's Spirit to worship the newborn king. It's like God is saying, look, I don't care about your social standing, your background, or your religious pedigree. What matters is your heart, your willingness to follow me.
I think that's one of the most beautiful and radical messages of the Christmas story. It's a message of inclusivity and hope. It's a reminder that God can use anyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, to accomplish His purposes.
So as we unpack these three powerful lessons from Crawford, God delights in simple people who love Him. Big things often start small, and when God says obey, do it quickly. It becomes clear that the birth of Jesus wasn't just a historical event, but an invitation to a way of life.
It's a call to radical humility, to embrace the unexpected, and to step out in faith, trusting that God will guide us every step of the way.
We've explored the Annunciation, the journey to Bethlehem, the humble birth in the stable, the arrival of the shepherds and the wise men, and now we've delved into Crawford's insights, drawing those rich connections between this ancient story and our lives today.
It's amazing how all these different pieces fit together so seamlessly, isn't it? It paints this incredible tapestry of faith, history, and personal transformation.
What fascinates me is how this event, the birth of Jesus, continues to resonate with people centuries later.
It's a timeless story, filled with hope, wonder, and the promise of new beginnings, and I think that's why we're still drawn to it, especially during this time of year.
It really is a timeless story, and something we talked about earlier, the idea that each of us has our own unique Christmas story unfolding, really resonated with me. It takes this grand historical event and makes it deeply personal.
It does, doesn't it? It's the beauty of the incarnation. The idea that God became human, entered into our messy, complicated world, and chose to work through ordinary people like us to bring about His purposes.
It's almost too incredible to grasp, and incredibly humbling when you think about it. If God could choose to work through Mary Joseph, those humble shepherds, even pagan wise men, then the possibilities for what He can do through us are limitless.
Precisely. And that brings us back to Crawford's powerful message about God delighting in simple people who love Him. It's a reminder that we don't need to have it all figured out. We don't need to be perfect or have some impressive spiritual resume. What God is looking for is a willing heart, a desire to follow His leading, even in those seemingly small, everyday moments.
It's like those shepherds again. They didn't just sit around discussing theology or debating the angel's message. They got up, they went, they acted. It's a call to put faith into action, to take those steps of obedience, even when we're not sure where they'll lead.
And those steps don't have to be grand or heroic. Remember Crawford's lesson about big things often starting small. It could be something as simple as sending a kind text to a friend who's struggling, offering a helping hand to a neighbor, or simply choosing to speak words of encouragement instead of criticism.
Those little acts of love and kindness, those seemingly insignificant choices, can have a ripple effect impacting the lives of others in ways we may never fully comprehend. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the birth of Jesus, I think the challenge for all of us is this. Considering that God chose seemingly ordinary people to play key roles in Jesus' birth story, what small or insignificant thing might he be calling you to do today?
What seemingly insignificant act of love, kindness, or obedience could you offer as your gift to the newborn king?
It's a beautiful thought to end on, and I hope it stays with our listener long after this deep dive is over. Because the Christmas story isn't just something we celebrate for a few weeks in December. It's an invitation to a way of life, a way of being in relationship with God that's marked by humility, obedience, and a willingness to participate in his ongoing work in the world.
And who knows, maybe in those small, seemingly insignificant acts of faithfulness, we'll discover our own unique Christmas story unfolding, filled with wonder, joy, and the transformative power of God's love at work in and through us.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive, and that these will leave inspired to embrace the wonder and the challenge of the Christmas story. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.